And now we are ready to move into our first session of today, a fireside chat on who is responsible for responsible AI, managing ESG and responsible AI in a rapidly changing world. We would like to welcome back Majid Mirza, the founder and the CEO of ESGTree, our organizing partner for the conference, alongside with Kevin Tuer, the Chief Technology Officer of Communitech, as well as Mardi Witzel, the co-founder and CEO of Polyalgorithm machine learning. And so, yeah, welcome to our speakers.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here again after an amazing first day and this wonderful opening, which is very inspirational. And I have a lot of things that I want to follow up on that as well. So let's start with a few introductions about who we have on the stage right now. When we've been connected with Communitech for a while, and recently I got connected to Mardi. But as we were having the planning sessions for this session, I was like, this is so awesome. Having people like Kevin and Mardi here to discuss what we see out there in the news all the time, and these think tanks forming, ex-FANG companies, Facebook, Google, etc., executives leaving their positions because of fears about where AI is going. So just to be able to discuss this topic with Kevin and Mardi, experts, is such a blessing today. Let me introduce Mardi first. Mardi is a co-founder and CEO of PolyML. Mardi is a technology and governance leader with over 2 decades of experience in strategic planning, payments, and communications. Mardi's current focus is at the frontiers of governance, including artificial intelligence, data, ESG, and sustainability. So now you know why Mardi's sitting on this stage. Kevin Tuer is the Chief Technology Officer of Communitech. We keep hearing about Communitech's pioneering efforts in the region and in Canada as we learn more and more about how the venture capital industry and the technology industry developed in Canada, which is still in its nascent stages. So every day we learn more about Communitech's contributions. At Communitech, Kevin is responsible for developing, implementing, and managing the organization's technology strategy and leading the development and deployment of data innovation and advanced technology products and services for founders and members. And before we get into questions, just a little bit of background on the panel. This panel reminded me of what my aunt once told me. She said, Majid, whenever you share a problem, pose a solution as well, because the brain is wired for acting on recommendations. She's a very intelligent person.
Yeah.
And so these days we're hearing a lot of doom and gloom about what AI might bring in terms of negative consequences, but we hardly hear about solutions. So what do we do? Like, what should we do as individuals, companies, organizations? And so this panel is based off issues addressed in the Voluntary Code of Conduct on responsible development and management of advanced generative AI systems by Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, which discusses various aspects of responsible AI, including accountability, safety, fairness and equity, transparency, human oversight and monitoring, validity, and robustness. So with that, I'd love to get into the first question, Mardi and Kevin, which is how can we support the ongoing development of a robust, responsible AI ecosystem in Canada?
Well, maybe the first thing I'll say is to place the voluntary code in context. Here in Canada, there are a number of different instruments, and I don't, if I'm going over well-trodden territory, forgive me, but I often think with audiences, they may not realize the regulatory context in which something like this has been introduced. So the first instrument that the Canadian government introduced, which was actually back in 2018, was something called the Algorithmic Impact Assessment. And that was a set of guidelines by which the federal government was going to hold itself to account for using algorithms. And that revolved around conducting impact assessments, so evaluating the risk and the likely impact on a number of different measures. And then nothing else happened until June of 2022, when the federal government introduced an update, Bill C-27, to consumer privacy protection. That included ADA, and many of you might be familiar with that, the proposed AI and Data Act, which has made its way through second reading and is in committee now, is in the Indu Committee. And then in, I think, July of 2023 or sometime mid-2023, the federal government introduced 2 new instruments. One, both of them voluntary, and I think this is key, whereas some of the times we're talking about binding legislation, and some of the time we're talking about voluntary instruments. So they introduced a generative AI code of practice for their internal application of generative AI, and they introduced this voluntary code that we're talking about today. You know, the first time I ever spoke in Waterloo about AI governance, I actually spoke at Catalyst, which some of you might have been at last night, and I opened up the talk with, how many of you think you came into contact with AI today? I mean, it's kind of hysterical, isn't it? We'd never open up a talk because everybody knows today, a mere 2.5 years later, that they're in contact with AI all the time. So I think what the federal government has done is they've come out with, piggybacking on proposed binding legislation, they've come out with a set of voluntary measures, which are essentially principles that they're hoping that private sector entities will pick up and follow and implement in some fashion in an effort to protect the ethical and trustworthy deployment of AI. So how can we promote that within the ecosystem, which was your question. First off, let's just recognize how big the ecosystem is. It includes developers, both from academia and from industry. It includes NGOs and consortia. It includes industry, big platform providers, and little early stage companies like the company that I work for. I'm a bit unusual that I work in technology, but I also write and think and speak in policy. It includes investors. 2 weeks ago, I spent a week in San Francisco meeting with VCs. And I mean, they are a vibrant part of the ecosystem. Educational institutions and end users, the public, particularly with the introduction of generative AI. So what are some things we can do to support this ecosystem? I think it comes down to a combination of policy, education, and efforts to support collaboration. So it seems to me a fundamental requirement that we lay out, and by we I mean any number of different players, intranational players, international players, federal government, and even companies themselves and NGOs to establish clear ethical guidelines for the development, implementation, and ongoing monitoring of AI. That's first and foremost. I think that these must, in particular, promote accountability and transparency. If we don't know how AI works, then I don't know how we evaluate really in any deep and meaningful way that it's ethical and trustworthy. And accountability meaning that the developers and deployers and implementers of AI be accountable for the AI that they're involved with. I think an investment in education and awareness, I mean, this is literally something that will touch every employee in a company that's implementing AI, not just the data scientists anymore, particularly since the introduction of generative AI. And lastly, the building of robust AI governance frameworks. So the 6 or 7 principles that Majid mentioned, for example, safety and security, accountability, those are principles. But what's underneath them? How do companies or enterprises actually operationalize those principles in a meaningful way? And we can talk about that a little bit, but I'll give Kevin a chance to address the question as well.
Thanks, Mardi. This is very interesting. Kevin, would you agree that policy, education, collaboration would be the direction we're going to, or should we add something to this?
I think those are all essential components of it. I think I really want to key on some things that Mardi said, because, I mean, the thing with AI that I think that's different from any other technology that we've encountered in the past is sort of the ubiquity of access and the scale with which its availability I mean, anybody with a laptop or a device, can access ChatGPT and can be creating in moments and in seconds. The good news is, you can be doing that quickly. The bad news is you can be doing that and deploying it quickly. And the regulatory framework cannot keep up that quickly. And I really want to key in on the accountability part, because I think we've gotten used to having, being part of an ecosystem where we've encouraged, and I come from a world with Communitech where we work with founders, where we encourage them to, go fast and break things, like get out there and try, and build things and see how they work, and get out there and test the market. With the underlying tone that, don't worry, somebody will be there to tell you when you've pushed the borders or pushed the limits. And I think we all come to think that that's government's role and solely government's role to do that. And I think where it's different with AI is that government's trying to figure this out at the same time. Yes. And whenever, I've never in my 30 plus years of working in technology seen a voluntary code of conduct or even open letters where leaders in the development of AI applications have said, let's all agree to stop development for 6 months to try to figure this out. I mean, that just gives you the sort of the idea on where we are at with this particular technology. So back to the accountability piece is, where this is different is, and you touched upon it, is, but I want to over-index on it, is the need for the individual to hold themselves accountable. It's not putting that onus on some third party to do that and to tap us on the shoulder when we've crossed that line.
Absolutely.
And that starts with education early. That starts with the collaboration. We at Communitech, and particularly in my roles at Communitech, have been building these ecosystems of support for a long time to support the founder along their journey. This is unlike anything we've seen. But again, we can't be crippled by sort of the Chicken Little effect. The sky is falling, and we can't be saying this is an existential risk, 10 years down the line. We got to be tackling this today, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is a tremendous opportunity for us. And we have to grasp this as an opportunity, and we have to be looking forward as to how can we use this to enable better health care? How can we do this to help solve some of the big problems that we have in the world today? And how can we bring together all of the ecosystem partners to do that? This is probably now more than ever when we need all of our ecosystem partners, be it government, be it not-for-profit, be in the private sector, where we really need to show that we can come together as a consortium and not only do it responsibly, but capitalize on the opportunities that we have to change the world and to do some really fantastic things.
I think that's a really important point that Kevin just made, which is, in addition to being concerned about the risks and the impacts of AI, if we're going to be successful as a country, but also as a global civilization in harnessing the good in the technology to solve some of our biggest problems, we have to actually really start leaning in and using it. And there is some concern that whereas Canada has been an early leader in AI, particularly in research and development and in the academic institutions and in the consortia, that we're on the verge of becoming a laggard when it comes to the application of the technology by our private sector.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating, and there's a bunch of questions here, but Kevin, some of the points you brought up and Mardi seconded, I'll go a little bit off topic here. They're so interesting, like responsibility at the individual level. And then the question becomes, if we're hoping for responsibility at the individual level, then some sort of education has to be provided, because it's really difficult for the individual with all of life's, with all of life happening, to go out and seek that education. For example, the work that Radical Ventures has done with investment due diligence, the work that ESG Tree is doing with Communitech for exploring ESG and AI blended frameworks. Your point just makes me think that I think that needs to also get out more, in the form of education and webinars and accessible so that the individual is empowered to act on it.
Yes, and I'm going to take it actually one step further. I think it's more than education, and this is going to be a bit of a shameless plug for what we're doing at Communitech around good AI. I think it's about empowering, for us, the founder with a playbook as to what does it mean to be responsible in terms of building product and service. What's the playbook? I mean, we talk about it like it's obvious. You know, we say to our founders, you know, be responsible, build ethical product. But what does that mean? Like, I've got the list of 6 or 7 things from the Voluntary Code of Conduct of what it means, but what does that mean when it comes to developing a product, and where does that live within the product lifecycle? Well, that's part of what we're doing with our Good AI effort is let's build that playbook. Because, I've been a founder myself. We've worked with founders with Communitech, and Marty, I think you can probably back me up on this. Is especially in the early stages when you're building product, you're worried about, how am I going to keep the lights on? How am I going to find product market fit? How am I going to keep my employees because somebody else is always looking to get them, snatch them from me? How in the world am I going to weave into this notion that I also have to, be responsible when there's no framework for which I can build that into my product life cycle? And I'm also a big advocate of the by design framework. Like, it's not build the product and then let's just bolt this ethics responsibility onto the end of it. And I'm borrowing the Ann Cavoukian privacy by design sort of framework because I think by doing that, you're probably going to end up with a product that is probably worse than not trying to build responsibility and ethics into it at all. So how do we actually help them to, from the very beginning, from the ideation stage, build that in and build that culture? It's not just about product. It's not just for the product design and life cycle. It's how you build that into the culture of the company so that, for me, ultimate success is we don't have to even talk about ethics and responsibility anymore. It's table stakes. It just happens because we know that we have to make sure that our product isn't biased. We know that we have to be transparent with our models. We know that we have to be compliant with privacy legislation. We know that we have to keep the well-being and the best interests of the users of our product and the individual first and foremost. It just happens, but it's a lift.
Absolutely, and ties in really well into our next panel, from seed to scale, integrating ESG, and then, of course, responsible AI is part of that. Mardi, Kevin also mentioned the VC or the investor angle. This vertical, which is so strong, usually from investor requirements are very influential. If a large investor especially, or an important investor comes and says, you must do this, it's likely to happen.
That's correct.
So could you talk a little bit about that responsibility of investors?
Well, I think that's an area that's changing for investors, but for lenders as well, who express an interest in understanding from a risk assessment standpoint and then a reporting and disclosure standpoint how AI is being used. I actually authored a paper with CG on AI as an ESG-related risk about 2 years ago. And I think we'll see AI, as I think of it, as a big S risk, essentially, make its way into the reporting and disclosure requirements of the International Sustainability Standards Board over time. If you go back and look at SASB, one of the earlier frameworks for ESG reporting, there are questions related to data security, there are questions related to privacy, but nothing related to consent associated with training AI models on private or even sort of allegedly public data, and nothing to do with the characteristics of the models themselves. For example, historic bias making its way in, which we know is a very, very common problem with AI. I mean, that's essentially what AI is machines learning to do things that historically only humans have been able to do by being trained on data. And if either the data is biased or the model is biased, you're going to get a biased answer. So I think ultimately we'll see reporting and disclosure standards grow to include considerations that are very, very AI specific, and historically they haven't been there. The company that I lead, PolyML, has a technology for developing and deploying fully interpretable models from structured data. So I literally live at the intersection of technology and ethical AI. So we're in a very fortunate space in that we can legitimately say we serve a gap that exists that will help from a development and deployment of ethical AI standpoint. If you can understand how a model is translating inputs into outputs, then you can evaluate the trustworthiness of it on a number of different grounds, including bias, for example. And then it helps with the accountability. But you think about how many models are out there that don't lend themselves to that kind of explainability or interpretability, and I would argue that it's most today. Because even before the rise, generative AI is, maybe with an exception, but I can't think of one, is a black box. We don't know what data those models are trained on, and we don't know how the models translate the inputs that we don't even know about into outputs, and so how to evaluate the trustworthiness of the outputs is just a huge question, and the industry itself recognizes it. I think you'll see explainability at some point make its way into the industry, but it's early days. Even in more traditional forms of AI like machine learning, it's proven to be a problem. The famous case of Amazon when they decided to use AI models to try to implement fair approaches to recruitment. They wanted to literally hire an equal numbers of men and women. It sounds pretty simple. Amazon is a huge, ultimately, technology company with scads of resources. And guess what their early implementation of this recruitment model did? It hired white men. Because guess what? It was trained on historical data of who had been hired by Amazon to those kinds of positions in the past, and the model learned based on historical data. And they were well-meaning. Their culture was to try to do the right thing. It was the stated mission of the project. But how you translate these principles that we're talking about into operational guidelines, that's a whole discipline by companies. And the accountability needs to be not just that the company says, we're going to try to do this, but how are we doing it? Who have we appointed to be responsible for whether we use models, and if so, how we go about procuring or developing those models. Procurement's a big issue, because if you're procuring, do you know what you're procuring? If you're developing, do you have robust mechanisms in place to do it in a safe and ethical way? And then I think ultimately it comes down to establishing guardrails, meaning metrics or measures that can be measured and reported on and monitored over time so that we understand where AI is being used and how it's performing and what the impacts are. So that's what I don't think the VC or even the lending community is actually demanding yet. I think the regulators are starting to talk about it. And thankfully, to Kevin's point, I do think that individuals inside enterprise recognize, whether it's for financial downsides or reputational downsides, that they owe it to themselves to bake this kind of operational mentality into the design of models. The challenge is generative AI, for most people, sort of seemed to come out of nowhere, and it put these models and tools and applications in the hands of literally anybody, not just data scientists, and we don't really know how they work. So we can't necessarily trust. We need to verify from, in most cases, certainly in any high stakes cases, there's a question of whether they should be used at all.
Absolutely. With a couple of minutes to spare, Mardi and Kevin, we want to give the audience a chance to ask one question. We can get one question in before we end. So let's see if there's any questions in the audience. Right there, that hand went up first. I think orange, is it orange shirt? Yeah, it's the lights, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Your talk has been absolutely amazing. Now, we have a business, and we're getting ready to start developing AI. And, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Your talk was amazing, but we're now getting ready to use AI in part of our development, and your cautions are well received. Thank you so much. Now, because we're working on affordable housing and we're working with a spectrum of people, one of the things that we're doing in AI is using it to help generate plans for people that we're working with. Now, what I'm wondering is, based on what you said about procuring data, clearly we have to be very, very careful. And I'm just wondering, in developing what we're doing here, do you have any cautions beyond what you have expressed today that we should be aware of?
Well, I'd say you'll never go wrong by considering who might be impacted by the AI models that you procure and implement, or that you develop and implement, and who might be impacted by the data that you employ in that task, and involve them in the consultation process. And then the second point I'd make, and I'll turn it over to Kevin, is just talk to a lawyer. There are lawyers today that spend a lot of time thinking and writing and consulting about the impact of AI on business, and I would go to somebody who understands data, privacy, and AI, and just run past them what you're planning to do. But not just lawyers, talk to your stakeholders as well.
Yeah, and my concern in what you've pointed out is just make sure there's no confidential data used in that model, especially if you're using generative AI, because that could become part of a private model and you could be violating confidentiality there. And I would, and we're going through this as an organization, you know, I think it's good to explore and use generative AI in particular, because it's available, it's out there to a lot of people. Consider developing a generative AI user policy. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but going through the process of that helps you think about these sorts of things, because you know, I think we get excited by the opportunity to create, that we don't think about things like, oh, I'm just going to throw some customer data into this model and see what it comes out with, only to realize after that, now where's that customer data going to be? It's out there on the internet somewhere, and I've probably violated some privacy legislation in doing so. So just methodically think about that, and Marty's pointed out there are some resources there to maybe start you on that journey. But
it's a great point, because before generative AI, there were other forms of AI, principally machine learning, but they were largely the purview of data scientists. And I once sat with most of the big banks in downtown Toronto, and I looked at them. This is about 2.5 years ago, before generative AI was around. And I said, how many sort of projects on the side of the desk are there that your governance people don't know about? And they all said, oh, they're around, and then you find them and you sweep them into the model governance approach. But with generative AI, it's literally tools that are at the disposal of everybody in the enterprise. And even if so absolutely, a policy is appropriate, but education so that employees understand, you know, where generative AI is safe for them to use and what the boundaries are and where you need to verify, that sort of thing.
just for fun, go to ChatGPT and ask it to generate a generative AI policy.
Yeah.
That's where I started.
Who hasn't? Yeah.
That's where I started.
Who hasn't used it to do anything?
And make it sound like it wasn't generated by Generative. Put that in the prompt as well. Make it sound human.
Exactly.
Marty and Kevin, thank you so much. Fireside chats always fly by faster than we want.
Yeah.
But this is a great introduction to spark this conversation, even for the rest of the day. And hopefully we can do more in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for leading such an important conversation, as advanced AI systems is an emerging field and many of us are keen to learn and know more.